everyone. It's been a minute, a really long minute, and a crazy one for sure, which is kind of a testament to the fact that this is an exciting time to be alive, despite the preponderance of tragedy and insanity all around us. First of all, I would like to apologize for the unannounced halt to the podcast after the pilot episode aired. There were a number of technical difficulties with production and continuity on the back end that led to my prolonged hiatus, some of which have been partially resolved. Without delving too much into what transpired, what happened with this podcast can be likened to a plane skidding off the runway just as the front landing gear lifts off the tarmac. The resultant aftermath would be, of course, freaked out passengers wanting off the flight. Publishing this second episode right now feels like a pilot passing along an in-flight message to an empty fuselage. So I won't be surprised if at this point I am practically speaking into a void that I hope will gradually fill itself back into thriving fellowship and community. And as for the very steadfast team of one who has remained with the podcast on the back end, I want to say thank you for your steadfastness through the slow progression of the work to get things back up and running. Given that this podcast has been offline for a considerable length, I believe a reiteration of the general scope of this project is long overdue and par for the course. Here on Eon Quest, I will be speaking on matters of various degrees of import to the human experience: faith, moral evolution, conflicts both internal and external, politics both local and international, a bit of history and civilization, the search for the self, the search for truth, and, of course, the leaks of ordinariness. And with that in mind, I bring you today's topic. Welcome back to the podcast. My name is Abdul Qawi Muhammad, and I hope everyone is hanging in there just fine. We are halfway through this decade, and it does feel like the world has been running, and for the foreseeable future will be running, entirely on an endless supply of pure, uncut insanity and jaw dropping disruptions. Starting with the COVID 19 pandemic at the beginning of the decade, and then the political shakeups around the world, the evolution of AI, trade wars, and open comebacks. Speaking of open combats, we are in the midst of rippling heat waves of armed conflict around the world, preeminently the ongoing wars in Ukraine and Gaza. With these two wars especially, the ashen embers of civilizational Cold War are now being fanned once again to sweltering temperatures. Right now, democracy does feel like it is having a deer in headlights moment. A deer in headlights, standing still, trapped at a crossroad, and in the crosshairs of authoritarian sharpshooters. The theaters of conflict have extended far beyond the battlefield into online spaces where news and narratives and ideas and discourse are the weapons of choice. You would be hard pressed to find any serious news agency, podcast, or social media channel not covering the ongoing wars from a myriad of perspectives, some skewed in favor of one side in good faith or otherwise. One fundamental axiom of warfare is that truth is the first casualty of war, and in the fog of war, when truth becomes a mirage in the middle of gale force smoke screen, the natural inclination of hostile parties and their supporters is to rally round their flags and stake their claims to the moral high ground. Of course, this is a fairly predictable and understandable course of action. While the onus is on each party to the conflict to present a solid case for bearing arms, the primary onus on third parties to the conflict comprises judging the legality, morality, and tenability of the conflict, while advocating for mediation, arbitration, proportionality, justice, and humanitarianism. The secondary onus, of course, is to forthrightly contend with the concatenation of ideas and rhetoric and actions that pave the pathway to the hellish realities of wars in the first place, in hopes that the erstwhile moral and political failures and the resulting human catastrophe serve as veritable teachable moments. However, it does seem that with these wars, especially the Israel-Gaza war, prominent voices of the old guard are hell-bent on moral grandstanding and the preservation of status quo. One of the framings of the conflict so far that I have a hard time stomaching is the black and white bifurcation of conflicting sides into good versus evil, freedom versus fascism, and democracies versus death cults, as if the nuance of history and the complexities of contemporary realities suddenly lose all relevance. These kinds of framing, to an even-minded, cold-eyed observer, are as comically myopic as they are insidiously reductive, and the fact that these framings are being pushed by arguably smart men makes it all the more invidious and appalling. Lending a veneer of intellectual sophistication to genocidal retribution is enough of a moral aberration to warrant calling into question the moral clarity that these men also profoundly profess. Going one step further to push the narrative of moral democracies is, in my opinion, a symptom of either intellectual dishonesty and ideological capture, or imbecilic arrogance and cult like state worship, as if democracy is the only moral and ethically legitimate means by which societies can and have oriented their affairs over time. Since the onset of the war in Ukraine and later on in Gaza, I have spent quite a lengthy amount of time reading and listening to the Sam Harris and Douglas Murray types to get the following impressions. 1. Democracies are not without reproach, but in comparison to non democracies, they possess some sort of unassailable reputation in the international pecking order. 2. In a showdown between a democratic and a non democratic country, you can go all in with the former and almost always come out the moral victor. By extension, whatever atrocities are carried out on the part of democracies, especially Western styled democracies, can be excused as merely horrible byproducts of the pursuit of a greater good. 3. The Cold War era battle lines need to be redrawn, this time around between democracies and death cults, chiefly jihadism and Islamism. For the purpose of this episode, I would like to contend with the first two impressions. It is possible that I am off the mark with my impressions, but I am fairly certain that I am right on the money. Democracies are not without reproach, and the mechanism for self-correction and recalibration, among other features and privileges, help make up for some of its systemic flaws. However, this capacity for self-correction and recalibration is not always an indicator of sound civilizational moral compass. More often than not, it is a manifestation of Machiavellian adaptation and cynical self-preservation. To believe that democracies are inherently morally superior is to believe that morality is the default nature of modern nation states, and that righteousness is the driving force behind the actions of states. Now, you don't need a college degree in international relations to tell you how far off the mark that kind of worldview is. To believe that democracies or that democratic nation states are inherently ethical and morally superior is to take a roseate view of political history and transnational relations and the moral evolutions of nation states, especially superpower democracies. One fallacious claim that is often touted in defense of democracy is the claim that democracies have never gone to war or rarely go to war with each other. This benchmark is used as some sort of yardstick by which to measure the validity of different forms of government, a benchmark that, in their estimation, Western style democracies surpass by many miles of magnitude. However, the claim that democracies have never gone to war with each other is an obvious lie. Cases in point: India and Pakistan in the mid to late 20th century, and of course in 2025. And then we have Israel and Lebanon in the late 90s and early 2000s, just to name a few. I can already hear objections. I mean, most of these countries are not shining examples of Western democratic model, people may say. They are at best tin pot democracies or at worst sham democracies. Hence, they come off as the exceptions to the central premise of the democratic peace theory. The reality is that a lot of these quote unquote exemplars of democratic ideals engage in actions that are supposedly singularly characteristic of tin pot democracies. Is it the populism, the economic inequality, corporatization of government through lobbying and big money politics? Just to name a few. And when one accounts for foreign policy overreach and proxy wars and interventionism and other underhanded forms of sabotage of national sovereignty, there isn't much of a substantial percentage difference between overt and covert wars waged by first world democracies on one hand and those waged by tin pot democracies and autocracies on the other hand. Western democracies may not have gone to war with each other in decades, but they sure have lit the fuse that detonated a number of fledgling democracies in Africa and Latin America, and torpedoed others in parts of Eastern Europe and the Middle East. Western democracies may not have gone to war with their co-equals in decades, but through coups and military interventions, through proxy wars and assassinations, and through the exploitative conservatorship of weaker countries, they sure have helped decapitate, in their view, defective democracies, or placed them on life support, or helped install autocracies in their stead. Iran in 1953 comes to mind, Guatemala in 1954, Chile in the 70s. The list is a mile long, really. I mean, let's take a look at Burkina Faso today. By a flip of a coin, what are the chances that the 18 or more assassination attempts on Ibrahim Traore's life are manifestations of the murderous machinations of a corporatized superpower democracy? Conversely, what are the chances that the assassination attempts were masterminded by a group of disgruntled and ambitious underlings within his ranks? To lean into this line of thought a little more, what are the chances that the attempts on his life were orchestrated by some dictatorial crackpot in chief running some authoritarian third world dystopia in the country next door? What are the chances? Democracies are neither inherently morally superior, nor are their actions primarily driven by ethical concerns. In the veritable wilderness of Darwinian anarchy that is the international system, the primary driving forces of the actions of nation states are survival, strategic interest, and maximization of power. Of course, democracies are not without their advantages, and it is true that multilateral cooperation between flourishing democracies help foster and maintain regional stability. But the keywords here are flourishing democracies. Even then, cooperation between some of these flourishing democracies remain cumbersome to uphold due to the competitive and anarchical nature of the international system. This is why democracies, especially superpower democracies, will not hesitate to ally themselves with authoritarian regimes that pose no threats to their survival, or strategic interests. Therefore, when men like Sam Harris and Douglas Murray cast their lot with Israel because, among other reasons, it is a bastion of liberal style democracy in a quote unquote festering sewer of authoritarianism and despotism and radicalism and failed statehood, it does beg the question: are democracies inherently incapable of committing atrocities? Are they, by virtue of their superiority over other forms of government, above carrying out underhanded forms of sabotage in pursuit of power maximization and strategic interest or even self defense? Are democracies immune to corrosive strains of authoritarian overreach, fascistic ultranationalism, rapacious imperialism, and quasi religious exceptionalism? To answer these questions and to come to a definitive conclusion, all anyone needs to do is to hold up a magnifying glass to the modern political histories of these reputable democracies and take a long, careful gander at the festering epidemic of their morality crusades over the ages. This brings me to my second impression, this idea that in a conflict scenario you can go all in with democracies and almost always come out the moral victor. Well, that's clearly not always the case. Look no further than Israel, a country whose birth was forged in the crucible of war and in the wake of the greatest Jewish tragedy, a country whose existence has now, over time, become centrally defined by the slow and steady hemorrhaging of Palestinian existence way before October 7th. Some people in the pro Israel camp, without any hint of irony and self awareness, bring up the argument that the true actualization of a Palestinian state is predicated upon the annihilation of the Jewish state. They equate far fetched aspirations with sordid reality. They draw parallels between the psychotic wet dreams of destroying a nuclear armed superpower on one hand and the real world destruction wrought by that same nuclear armed superpower. Anyone with a credible shred of rationality and morality can advocate the moral justifications for Jewish self determination concretized by the establishment of a Jewish homeland, a nation of people that had been pushed to the brink of extinction simply cannot be wholly dependent upon the capricious beneficence of host countries. Furthermore, anyone remotely tethered to the harsh historical realities of 20th century colonial nation building can make a case for the political and moral expediency of the Balfour Declaration, the Partition Plan, and the War of Independence while also conceding the geopolitical miscalculations and moral catastrophes thereof. No colonial creation is without its tumult. Shit happens. However, it doesn't take much to come to terms with the fact that Palestinians have been historically dealt a terrible hand, both by malignant external sovereign actors and admittedly by short-sighted monomaniacal Palestinian leaders who had jettisoned pragmatic statesmanship for revolutionary glory, thereby missing the opportunity to take advantage of any of the number of off-ramps like Egypt and Jordan did many decades back. Also, it doesn't take much to contend with the fact that following its landmark gains, a modicum of strategic empathy on the part of Israel and its allies in the fashion of a post-war Germany Marshall Plan could have helped the Palestinian leadership steer their people towards relative justice and peace and prosperity following the Nakba and the Intifadas. Now, today, with the benefit of all these facts and complex history before us, it is hard to miss the stone-cold capacity of the Harris and Murray types to make sense of occupation and annexation and genocide and epistemicide. It is hard to not notice the sterile dispassion with which they view historically lopsided deals and poison pill accords forced down the throats of Palestinian leadership over the past couple of decades. It is hard to ignore the penchant for pointing accusatory fingers at the eschatological extremism of one side, while abetting by way of omission or downplaying the eschatological extremism of the other side. Their superhuman tunnel vision, occasioned by the so-called moral emergency of October 7th, that superhuman deformity that conveniently helps them block out the history of atrocious cycles of repression and resistance, is very much indicative of their incapacity at strategic empathy and civilizational self-reflection. When they throw their entire moral weight behind a bastion of democracy that incentivizes radicalization through fascistic dispossession, unchecked land theft, slow motion ethnic cleansing, and demographic change, duplicitous diplomacy, disregard for international law, and the repeated and successful thwarting of the movement for Palestinian self determination, one is forced to call into serious question their claims to personal moral clarity and civilizational superiority. Since when does being a democracy immunize a country from the diseases of oppression and state backed terrorism? Since when does being a democracy sanctify mass murder and starvation and immiseration? In a showdown between a democratic and a non democratic country, you may always go all in with the former, but don't expect to always come out the moral victor. There is no coming out the moral victor in this, Sam, Douglas. There isn't. You too, among many other cheerleaders of this war, have explicitly refused to acknowledge the drip, drip, drip of Israeli aggression against Palestinian lives. Israeli aggressions that have been meticulously documented by experts, by the way, teams of international experts, individual scholars and researchers, and humanitarian organizations, all of whom have made the case for the legitimacy of the Palestinian cause, many of whom have made the case for the existence of apartheid and occupation and ethnic cleansing and demographic change, some of whom had made the case for plausible genocide some 3 4 months into the war, and have now made the case for genocide some 20 odd months into the conflict. Experts with whom you would vehemently disagree with, despite your glaring lack of expertise. Experts with whom you would disagree with because their findings aren't tailored to your narrative of the IDF being the most moral army. At no point have you two even bothered addressing what should be the legitimate parameters of Palestinian resistance to occupation, nor have either of you contended with what should be the acceptable parameters of self defense by Palestinians against settler violence and the Israeli state at large. Not that I think you two are rightful authorities on this matter anyway, because you're not. And neither are you two good faith interlocutors that anyone should give their time of the day when it comes to the topic of Israel. I don't think either of you even recognizes the occupation and apartheid as such, let alone the concept of Palestinian identity. You two have done nothing but cherry pick what you choose to acknowledge about the Palestinian plight and the complex history of the conflict. You strawman people's hate for genocide as support for Hamas. You gaslight a global movement that empathizes with a perennially short-changed underdog, while you cheerlead atrocious injustice and gloss over war crimes as collateral damage. And with the parallels you and your types have drawn between Hamas and Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, it is not a stretch of the imagination to believe that you too would have no moral qualms with Israel nuking Gaza back to the Stone Age and then dragging it back, kicking and screaming into quote unquote enlightenment and civilization. Democracy or not, injustice is injustice. War crime is war crime. Genocidal retribution is genocidal retribution. Democracies are not inherently moral. Democracies are not always the good guys by default. Democracies have been on the wrong side of history before and will be for the foreseeable future, and no amount of accusations of moral confusion will change that. With regards to my third impression, that will be a topic for a separate episode as I am now nearing the limit of my allotted time. Final thoughts. Democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. So goes the quote attributed to Winston Churchill. I am somewhat partial to that quote, given that I am a beneficiary of the admittedly limited privileges of a third world democracy. Democracies are not without their upsides. One of the advantages, one of the saving graces of this system is its mechanism for self correction, albeit slow and sometimes painful. It is a system that has made significant strides in areas such as individual sovereignty, human rights, voting rights, and minority rights. But the moral evolution of democracies have been largely driven by minority struggles against entrenched power structures. Whatever morality democracies lay claims to today are not the products of prescient and calculatedly ingenious ideological engineering, but are upgrades that had to be force-fed into the system by the bottom-up struggles of minorities seeking the democratic dividends originally denied them. Even today, with the benefit of civilizational hindsight, democracies are not driven by ethics and morality. The primary motivation of nation-states, democratic or not, remains immutable: survival and power. Not freedom, not parity, not ethics, not morality, just survival and power. And this truth is exemplified by the actions of Israel and its democratic allies against a beleaguered minority way before October 7th and after. The power to shape the fate of the world, the power to project international law, and the power to ignore it when convenient, the power of veto, and the power to embody the mantra, might makes right, and to look away from these gaping rifts and fault lines between the moral proclamations of democracies on one hand and their real world power moves on the other hand is to be like Sam Harris and Douglas Murray, eloquent but blind curt jesters mythologizing the glory of a castle on fire. That's it for today's episode. I'll catch you all on the next one. Thank you.